Hi everyone, it's Erica, and for this week on diversity, I'm going to talk about specifically race and ethnicity and their effects on aging. And you'll see throughout this presentation that often gender and class could be interchanged anytime we're talking about race and ethnicity, but I'm going to try and specifically talk about those where possible. So first, I want you guys to imagine an older person around age 70. Just close your eyes and picture that person. All right, so what do we see in our imagination? Are they female or male? What race are they? What are they wearing? What are they doing? And obviously, the answers to these questions really lie probably within, our personal demographics, who we associate in our lives that's older. But a lot of what we talk about in chapter 7 in learning to be old is sort of the inherent biases that we place on the demographics of aging and how that can shape and ultimately harm the policy that's made out of those biases and out of those assumptions. So here's a few pictures of some older people that, I just actually Googled old person on Google Images, and out of the over 100 images that came back, they were mostly white males. There was literally only 3 black people. They were all males. So this just goes to show, I had to specifically Google older woman to get an African American woman to show up. So that kind of, again, goes to show the inherent biases, even in just the accumulation of images that will come back from one search. So speaking to those biases, they can often seem innocuous on the surface level, but as race and ethnicity and class and gender, like I said, are determinants of how well Americans age, it's important to keep those biases in mind when we're talking about policy and, more importantly, when policymakers are implementing said policy. So when we pigeonhole these groups based on what we think a group should look like, those prejudices are reflected in everything from popular culture, like we talked about in Media Day, to public policy. And in the US, 25% of 65-year-olds will be people of color. So that's a large chunk of that chunk of people. And in Georgia alone, that proportion will jump to 44% by 2050. So almost half of people over 65 in Georgia in 2050 will be not white. So Hispanic, Latino, Asian, African American, and everything else. And traditionally, this group, 65-year-olds and older, are the last demographic to reflect shifts in race in our culture. So usually it's the under 18 group that shows diversity the most quickly, and then it's 19 to 64, and then it's 65 and over that starts to lastly reflect those changes. So the fact that, and this US stat right here is actually, I think that's 2030. So that's the one that's coming up quickly. 2050 is the one that's more advanced. But the fact that by 2050, almost half of this group in Georgia is going to be people of color, non-white people, it shows that we should shift away from forming policy that's only going to benefit white people. And even if we're not inherently building policy that way, it's sort of been how it's how it's been done in the past, just by nature of that being the largest chunk of the group. And like I said, it's ultimately a disservice to these said groups of people of color to still treat them as a minority. When we'll see in a second from this next chart, the term minority in and of itself is pretty misleading, because now we have the term majority minority, which means the time when more people will be people of color than non-white. And actually, I think in Georgia that's going to happen about 2030, just for the whole population, not 65 and over. And it's going to happen a few years later in the whole US. So the term minority in and of itself is very misleading. And you'll see in this chart, I actually made this for a project I worked on at Carl Vinson Institute over the summer. This is 2013 right here, and this is 2050. And as you'll see in 2050, of the 65 and older, it's going to be 57% white, 27% black, 8% Hispanic, and 9% other. And in Georgia, that other largely is people Asian descent. So you'll see a big shift from 2030 over here, where the 65 and up group is 73% white. And then, in a little under 40 years, it's shifted down to 57% and is projected to continue to decrease in white and increase in the other groups. So again, the point here is that the term minority is very misleading and sort of does other groups a disservice. And also, people that were traditionally labeled as minority are no longer going to be the smaller proportion of the population. So it's just sort of a moot term at this point. And then we kind of can start talking about people of color in their older years as a reflection of their former lives. So there was a good quote in the book that said, economic status is a mirror or a map of their former lives. So this basically means, which we can rationally understand, when you turn 65, nothing inherently changes other than you start to become eligible for some benefits. But whatever adversity or advantages you had in your life from 0 to 64, you'll probably carry on into 65. And just by labeling this group as senior citizens or elderly or whatever we want to call them, we still have to look at them as parts of the other groups they belong to, especially if they're racial and ethnic marginalized groups that really affected their ability to accumulate wealth and good health throughout the rest of their lives. That's not going to magically change when they're 65, so we need to look at gerontology that way. And specifically, a third of older women in the U.S. are poor. So out of all of the poor women, out of all of the women in the U.S., a third of the older women are poor. Of this group, 58% of older Black women are poor. So they're facing a much higher rate of poverty in older Black women. And for Latinas, it's 47%. So overall, for all women, it's 33%. And then it starts to get higher for groups, specifically Latinas and Black women. And 85 and older women of color living alone are the most likely to be poor. Life spent in the fringes, basically like on the outskirts of society, not being able to access healthcare, having more working class, labor intensive job, poor wages. All of that leads to a cumulative life disadvantage. So basically, while we may look at it as just different variables that affect your life, over a lifetime, it accrues to amount to a cumulative disadvantage where all of that stuff sort of was a perfect storm of disadvantage. The opposite being the cumulative advantage, which is the much more normative, sort of unseen, subconscious privilege. And that usually comes from being white or being middle class or above. And there was another good quote that said, being middle class gives me the privilege of being oblivious to class. So if you're not having to worry about it and your class doesn't affect your day-to-day life, it's much easier to either pretend it doesn't exist or not notice it. Where if you're in the fringes, like we said before, you're going to be much more conscious, much more aware of your class and how it subjugates you based on your fellow citizens. And I think this is really true for race as well. People like to throw around the term of being colorblind and that they don't see race, and that's usually said by white middle class people that have the privilege of not having to think about color because they've never faced a situation where the color of their skin determined anything but the privilege they inherited. So once you take a step back, you see that the only reason you're oblivious to it is because you're not affected by it. So this sort of leads to the explicit and implicit racism that is kind of in place when we talk about minorities and marginalized groups as the quote-unquote other. And like I said, the inherent bias that comes from placing them in a different group that's just not white. So the health of marginalized people, quote unquote minorities, is often determined by new morbidity factors, which is anything that's outside of the traditional definition of morbidity, which we know is just the absence of physical illness. So factors like violence, substance use disorders, crime, and the psychological toll that stress will take after a lifetime of discrimination. All of these factors, the book argues, should go into a new concept of morbidity that takes into account the effects not only of an aging body, but an aging body that had the cumulative disadvantage of being affected by these new morbidity factors. And it kind of points to the inherent problem in a couple of these definitions. Like I already said, minority. I mean, it's not true if that group is larger than 50%, which they will be soon. Not to mention just the inherent nature of the othering effect of using that term. A minority is less than. So it's sort of the subconscious effect of that by being labeled a minority would compel one to think that they were less than the norm and have to work up to meet that standard. And basically what the term came about from was just meaning not white. So I guess that at the time it was more PC to say minority than not white, but if we understand everything in terms of white and not white, we're doing a disservice to the quote-unquote not white group. And like I just said, morbidity is just the absence of illness, and that term gets thrown around a lot with aging as multiple morbidities come in and chronic illnesses, and the likelihood that one sickness or one illness will lead to another. But those morbidities need to do a better job of encapsulating what it might mean to have a new morbidity, or these outside, often more psychological factors that can have a very much a very prominent effect on aging. And I included this link here to the APA if you want to go check it out. It's an article about the stress that racism causes in the people that are experiencing the racism, and especially over time, and how it can actually end up leading to even our traditional ideas of morbidity, much less the more mental illness side. So I think it's important to incorporate the concept of new morbidity when we're talking about aging, specifically for groups that have sort of been, systematically left out of the healthcare system. The book also has a couple of really good examples about how caregiving and retirement, two institutions very much wrapped up in aging, affect marginalized people much differently than they do the normative groups. Caregiving responsibilities are often much more intense for people of color and people of working class backgrounds, because they don't have the money to buy a caregiving service and bring that in for their family. So that responsibility falls on to the family, who then have to give up their own wages, and how retirement is essentially only a reward if you've had a pension and you've had, the years to build up equity and to invest in IRAs, and therefore have a built-in advantage to when you can stop working. And if you don't have those things, retirement is honestly a disadvantage, because it takes away, it's a reduction in wages, essentially. If you stop working, you're not going to be earning, and if you qualify for your benefits, you're going to get that, but we know that that's not nearly the same as actually bringing in a working income. And many people of color don't even live long enough to get to collect Social Security. One example was the average lifespan of a black male in Washington, D.C. is 58 years old. So they're not even making it to that cutoff point. So there's no equity built. Any family that was going to inherit that income, it's just simply gone because they died before they qualified. So a lifetime of working into the system and paying into the system but not getting anything out disproportionately affects people of color who traditionally die earlier than white, middle class, or above people who are able to build that equity over time. And obviously, raising the benefit age will thusly further disproportionately affect these marginalized groups. And a couple suggestions real quick. Gerontology should expand the lens through which it looks to more diverse groups, and all gerontology should expand to include ethnogerontology to better serve all groups not just white people who are old. And here's my sources.